Good morning, and thank you all for being here. It's been a phenomenal week for me. I arrived on Sunday and had the opportunity to participate in the Dog Week, where I got to share some digital stories and photo voice examples and give people a sense of one of the end products of some of these participatory processes. But I also got to listen to and learn about the kind of research that's being done here. And it's also been a tremendous privilege to have all of you engage with our think pieces so thoughtfully. So I think I speak on Sarah and Sipagazi's behalf when I say thank you so much for engaging with our think pieces the way that you have. I certainly have a lot of food for thought. I'm inspired, and my reading list has grown exponentially as my podcast to listen list. Okay, so how can we move towards an ethics of trust? And why should relationships, in the context of higher education research, be centered on trust? My reflections on the answers to these questions are divided into three sections, in which I share some lessons learned from various research projects about the values, principles, and practices that I think are indispensable to building, repairing, and maintaining trust in research relationships. These reflections capture some of my thoughts on why it is important to avoid formulaic interpretations of ethical principles. Instead, I contemplate an ethics of trust, one that encourages us to pay more careful attention to and allows ourselves to be inspired by the context in which we work, the people with whom we work, and the relationships we build with people for and through research. I'll start with the notion of building or establishing trust. So in 2022, my colleague and I completed a project where we had worked with 12 student activists at the University of the Free State. And the purpose of the project was to co-create and co-conceptualize the idea of what universities would look like if they functioned as sustainable communities. One of the research methods we used was digital storytelling to elicit powerful narratives that are crafted to take the audience on a journey by engaging us both emotionally and intellectually through combining the art of storytelling with multimedia features like photography, text, video, audio, and voiceover. One of the key activities in creating a digital story is something called a storytelling circle, where research participants are brought together in a safe space for them to share their stories, to generate connectivity, and stimulate dialogue. In our case, we were interested in stories on the role of protest, activism, and collective action in transforming universities into more sustainable and decolonial institutions of learning. Some of the narratives in the digital stories were deeply moving because they were so personal. For instance, in Activism Without a Forest by Tiamo, we heard about the sense of loneliness and isolation he experienced as a permaculture activist who struggled to find like-minded people to work with. In another story, Tsepang asks, what is the price of activism? As he reflects on his participation in the Fees Must Fall protest and explains how being an activist compromised his mental health. When viewing the stories at the exhibition that concluded the project, I felt proud. I really did. I thought we'd done something that widened students' narrative capabilities. And by capabilities, I refer to Amartya Sen's capability approach, in which he conceptualizes capabilities as the effective freedoms that are valued and pursued by individuals, which are both the means and the ends of human development and well-being. In brief, a core focus of the capability approach is on the effective opportunities people have to be and to do what they have reason to value. Michael Watts draws on the capabilities approach in his account of narrative capabilities, which he defines as a substantive freedom to deploy one's narrative capital in order to be heard and acknowledged. I think we all value having the effective opportunity to tell our stories, to be heard, to be acknowledged. But I also know what it's like to sit in a storytelling circle and what it's like to experience emotional distress and to struggle to recount very specific memories that are somewhat painful, but also joyful. Memories. I've been learning. In the process of telling one story, that it's not an easy process. And I think when I witnessed this and participated in the storytelling circle myself for the first time about 5 years ago, I wasn't the only one in the room who felt very uncomfortable and who struggled. Many people needed time out to kind of gather themselves from what was happening. And I think most of us were unaware of just how much emotional labor would be involved in telling our stories and in listening to the stories of others. Of course, not everyone finds storytelling circles to be emotionally demanding or somewhat triggering, but they are designed to make people talk publicly about very personal and highly sensitive, often difficult issues. So I know how cathartic it can be. I've seen time and time again how the process can result in stories that are deeply moving and powerful. But I'm also concerned about how storytelling circles work, because they are designed to make people feel vulnerable and at the same time safe enough to pour out their most personal stories, which are then sort of appropriated for research purposes instead of being treated as sacred. So despite the fact that I think it is worthwhile to do research in ways that expand narrative capabilities, I have been asking myself if it is fair, appropriate, humane, or ethical to elicit stories in this way and then to use them for research. I think these questions come up for me because I'm troubled by the fact that we demand and we take, when I say we, I mean researchers, we demand and we take so much from participants to the extent that research in general, but I think storytelling methodologies in particular, can be extractive and almost exploitative. So from an ethical standpoint, these are some of the harms that participatory methods and methodologies are actually geared to reduce. But these are harms that can so easily be reproduced if we don't tread carefully. So I'm not sure if it's ethical to encourage research participants to trust us with their deeply personal stories when we do not share ours with them. And I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we expect research participants to trust the process and to trust us when we have not done anything, or not much, to demonstrate our trustworthiness or earn their trust. So my intuition is that there should be much more reciprocity in research relationships and in storytelling processes, but also in interviews. I think Grant was saying this this morning. So I wonder if we might start by reciprocating vulnerability as the first step to establishing trust. I'll now talk about the notion of repairing trust. Last year, on a different project, a colleague and I worked together with young people to understand the ways in which the pursuit of higher education is complicated by social spatial exclusions. The project involved 12 youth from Freedom Square, which is an upgraded informal settlement in Bloemfontein. The project also involved a community-based organization that acted as a gatekeeper to Freedom Square. It was important to us that we partner with people who live and work in Freedom Square and are already doing community work and engaging with young people. In this project, we applied photo voice, a participatory method where photography is used to capture visual narratives that raise awareness about community challenges. And in our case, the youth developed visual narratives to show what attempting to access higher education looked like for them, and how their attempts, successes, and failures were affected by where they come from. Now, a key objective of Photo Voice is to stimulate critical dialogue. And again, the narrative capabilities of the youth matter to us. We wanted to make sure that they would not be deprived of the effective opportunity to tell their story and to tell it freely, and to fully share their critical reflections. We care about this because it has implications for the development of epistemic courage, which is stimulated through speaking out, having a point of view, and expressing oneself with confidence. I think many of us know very well that in South Africa, young people who lack middle-class forms of expression or a certain level of English proficiency can often be disregarded as credible contributors to knowledge. So we were interested in methodologies that would avoid that from happening. So one of the activities we did at the workshop was a community mapping exercise where the youth worked in groups to identify the strengths and limitations of living in Freedom Square. At one point, they were engaged in a very heated debate about community members who they saw as role models. And some of the people that they mentioned as role models were said to be instigators of mob justice. So as you can imagine, the discussion was emotionally charged, and the youth also expressed their frustration at the lack of intervention by government to help reduce social ills like drug abuse and crime in Freedom Square. When Tabiseng, the director of the community-based organization, listened in on this discussion, she was taken aback. She didn't understand what we were doing. She said, what do these discussions have to do with youth aspirations and higher education? When she disrupted our workshop that day, she told us that she could not tolerate the kind of discussions we were having, and that she just didn't understand why we had to talk about those social ills in the community and so on. She didn't see the connection. And she also ended up saying some things that were quite hurtful to research participants and that affected the research space badly. Things that were hurtful to people like Tebo, who sent us a voice note after we had to cut short the workshop. And in the voice note, he complained about what had happened. He said, our stories are very important to us. This is not some joke. We're not just doing this for fun or whatever. We might be doing it for compensation, but we are putting everything into this project. And I really didn't appreciate the things she said to me. I took it personally. And I feel like it's because she gave us this platform that she gets to dictate everything. He went on to say that he felt repressed and couldn't be himself in Tabiseng's presence, and that he was considering pulling out of the project. I was moved by Tsepo's voice note, especially because it reminded me that he was trusting us with his story, and I didn't want to do anything to betray that trust. So we cut Tabiseng off. That's not her real name. I think she was unfamiliar with, but also confused by our photo voice process, and she therefore didn't trust what we were doing, and then she became mistrustful of us as researchers. So she lost her trust in us. Because we had built a solid relationship with the participants, we decided to continue with the project, but without her. And so we changed the venue of the remaining workshops, and the exhibition was held on campus instead of being held in Freedom Square. In the end, though, most people who the youth would have wanted to attend the exhibition couldn't be there. Their parents, community members, neighbors, and other stakeholders that they had taken the time to identify. At the time, I was sure that we had made the right decision, a decision that was ethical, and perhaps it was. But in hindsight, I wondered what we could have done differently. And there are some mistakes that we made. For example, we were so intent on flattening hierarchy that we stopped acknowledging Tabiseng's seniority, which is an important cultural norm for Black people. For instance, we called her by her first name, as we did all research participants, and we encouraged them to call us by first name. So we weren't calling her Aus Ntabiseng or Me Ntabiseng. Although these are small things, I think she would have appreciated any indication that we respected her and saw her as an elder, despite our closeness and proximity in terms of age. But we were paying so much attention on getting the research done that we made a hasty decision and ignored the harm done to our relationship with her. Yes, she was difficult, and she had some ideas about how we should be doing things that just didn't align with our participatory approach. But I think she ultimately felt disrespected and felt that we didn't take her seriously enough. I think we could have shown some humility and more willingness to hear her out, to explain the process of photo voice more carefully, or to negotiate with her and see if there was room for compromise, so that we might go about doing things a little bit more her way and a little bit less our way. I think showing our humility might have allowed us to see Ntabiseng not just as a means to an end or a bridge to Freedom Square, but as a whole person with her views, values, experiences, and ideas that may have been helpful to us had we treated her differently instead of simply dismissing her. And I think dismissing her was kind of easy because at the time we thought, well, she's just a gatekeeper and not a research participant. So she lost her trust in us and in what we were doing, and in turn we lost our trust in her as a research partner. When trust is lost or broken in this way, how do we begin to repair it? I think if we care about treating all research partners and participants with dignity and respect, we have to begin the repair work by being humble. So that despite our confidence in what we're doing through research, and despite our beliefs about the ways that it should be done, we leave room for negotiation, entertain the possibility that we've done wrong, and pay more careful attention to context and relationality in knowledge making. I'm finally going to move on to talking about maintaining trust, but it's very much connected to what it takes for it to be built and maintained. From 2021 until 2023, I worked on a project that investigated how university education helps or gets in the way of transforming rural communities, if it does this at all. And the project documents through narratives what life after university looks like for rural youth, including the complex challenges they face and the trade-offs they need to make in pursuit of various aspirations. Each year, I interview the 35 participants and then held workshops for them to reflect on and write about life after varsity. One of the participants is a young man from the Eastern Cape, and those who are at Dog Week would have seen his digital story where he centers his mother's absence in thinking about the value of going to university. So he graduated with a social work degree from Walter Sisulu University in 2019. And he was a participant in the previous project, which ran from 2016 to 2021. So he was involved in this one from 2021 to 2023, which means I've known him now for about 7 years. Over the years, what I've noticed in our conversations is that he's become much more open and candid in his reflections, and much more willing to share very personal reflections. In one of our interviews, we talked about how he was dealing with being unemployed, how he was experiencing it and kind of coping with it. So I asked him to describe a day in his life, and if he saw any parallels between his own lives and the lives of other young people in his community. Then he responded by giving an example of how on a Sunday he might be sitting in a tavern and witnessing other young people drinking, and that he would catch himself judging them because he's about to ask, why aren't you preparing for tomorrow? It's Monday, you shouldn't be here. And he says he would catch himself because it would feel like, well, I'm judging them, but I'm here with them. So how am I any different? And actually, I'm failing to be a role model to them. So most research participants do not find it easy to share these kinds of critical self-reflections in interviews. And I mean, there are many reasons why, but I think a lack of trust in the process, a lack of trust in us as researchers might be one of them. Because we often work so quickly to initiate projects, implement them, wrap them up, so we can publish from that work as soon as possible, that we just don't really take the time. But when we do research in this hurried way, I think we compromise opportunities to build trust and sustain it over time. And there's hardly any time to then repair it when it is broken. This has implications for how honest participants are willing to be with us, I think. Whether we're asking them for their views on policy, institutional culture, or just about any other issue, why would we expect them to be really honest with us if they don't trust us? In a world where time is treated as a commodity, it is difficult to learn how to trust each other when we barely have the time to get to know one another. And so I wonder if it's in this context, if we might consider it unethical to rush research and to deny knowledge-making processes the time that they deserve. So how do we move towards an ethics of trust? I base my reflections on lessons learned from various projects that focus on the use of stories for knowledge-making and knowledge-sharing purposes. But these lessons, I think, are relevant for thinking about ethical practices in research in general. We all go through the institutionalized ethics clearance procedures, but once ethics clearance is granted, I think we seldom think about what counts as ethical practice for the project that I'm busy with now. And I'm not talking about principal ethics where concerns about confidentiality, anonymity, and informed consent often take center stage. I'm talking more about what is captured in a blog piece that I read by some colleagues who talked about centering research ethics on relationships. In the blog, they say the onus is on the researcher to navigate ethical boundaries and values, to define a bespoke ethical approach for each study that works for all involved in that particular project. And I think any bespoke ethical approach should be formulated based on critical reflections on how we do research. And these reflections should be sensitive to context as well. For many of us in this room, that context is South Africa, and I don't think we need to look far to find inspiration for developing ethical principles that emerge from indigenous worldviews and philosophies. Many chapters in the recently published Handbook of African Philosophy of Difference reinforce what many of us know, that African cultures celebrate communal values like mutual aid, care, concern for others, interdependence, solidarity, reciprocal obligation, and social harmony. And that African worldviews tell us that individuals recognize and attain their own true good by promoting that of others. It is within such a framework of thought that Ubuntu emerges as a popular African philosophical concept. And again, most of us would have heard or read things like Ubuntu is the capacity in African culture to express compassion, reciprocity, dignity, harmony, and humanity in the interest of building and maintaining community. Bonani also adds that a person with Ubuntu is welcoming, hospitable, warm, generous, and willing to share. That such people are open and available to others, are willing to be vulnerable, are affirming of others, and do not feel threatened that others are able and good, for they have a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that they belong in a greater whole. They know that they are diminished when others are humiliated, diminished when others are oppressed, and diminished when others are treated as if they were less than who they are. Treating each other as less than who we are erodes our humanity, and I think it undermines our capacity to make valuable contributions to shared knowledge, which is a form of epistemic injustice. In her book, Miranda Fricker describes epistemic injustice as a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. Similarly, Anita Ho explains that as both a moral concept and as an epistemic concept, epistemic justice is a type of wrong and harm that is done to individuals or social groups regarding their ability to contribute to and benefit from knowledge creation. This form of injustice, she says, can happen in three interrelated ways. The first example she gives is one of unequal distribution of hermeneutical resources, such as conceptual understanding and articulative ability that would be necessary to achieve or contribute to knowledge. An example here might be what I mentioned earlier on about having low English level proficiency or lacking in the kind of middle class forms of expression that tend to be highly valued in universities. A second way in which epistemic injustice can occur is when certain people's capacity as knowers or collaborative learners is unfairly dismissed. And here I'm going to perhaps use the example if we had dismissed Ntabi Singh simply because she was a gatekeeper. So in this case, it doesn't quite apply because we considered other factors when we decided not to work with her. But very often people are dismissed. We use our prejudice to dismiss them as non-credible testifiers or knowers. The third way in which epistemic justice can happen, says Anita Ho, are when there's inter-method hierarchies, where certain methods of inquiry or research are uncritically dismissed, while other methods are categorically presumed to be superior. Here I might use the example of participatory or arts-based approaches in higher education research, perhaps not being seen in the same light or being judged to be of the same quality as other methods. I think all these examples of epistemic injustice and how it can play out have mistrust and misrecognition embedded in them. Mistrusting people who struggle to articulate themselves, misrecognizing people who have the capacity to contribute to knowledge, mistrusting unfamiliar research methodologies. So when we form research relationships and we neglect the role of trust, I do think we relate to each other as if we are less than who we are. And because we're talking about relating to each other in the context of research, I extend this to say when we treat each other as less than who we are, we also wrong each other in our capacities as knowers. It is for these reasons that I think working towards a specifically relational ethics of trust is important. So to conclude, I'll return to the question, what does it take for relationships in the context of higher education to be centered on trust? It takes time, but it also takes vulnerability, reciprocity, and perhaps most importantly, humility.